Welcome back, everybody. We had a slight change of schedule. We will hear now from Mr. Peter Willis from Bird and Bird speaking about REMIT issues, about the energy anti-abuse rule, and we will hear from Rina Lohia after Mr. Willis has spoken. So welcome, Peter. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for listening into this session. So this is a session on REMIT, so the EU regulation on energy market manipulation. What I'm going to talk about this morning for the next 20 minutes is a quick reminder of the prohibitions. Then I'll go through some of the recent infringement decisions of a number of the authorities around Europe. I was going to talk a little bit about some guidance from ACER on the subject of balancing markets and some interesting guidance on algorithmic trading. A brief look at how REMIT has been applied during the coronavirus pandemic, and then a couple of conclusions. If you've got access to my slides afterwards, I produced this a few months ago, which is an overview on one page of the REMIT prohibitions, which you might find interesting. If you don't have it, then drop me a line afterwards and I'll send you a link to it. So a quick reminder of REMIT. So it contains two key prohibitions. It prohibits wholesale energy market insider trading and market manipulation, and it also contains obligations in relation to publication and reporting of transactions. It applies to contracts for the supply and transport of power and gas and certain derivatives. Market manipulation, which is what we'll be mainly focusing on this morning, means entering into a transaction or issuing an order, so whether or not the order is fulfilled, that sends false or misleading signals or secures or attempts to secure prices at an artificial level, or employs or attempts to employ fictitious devices. So any sort of attempt to mislead the market or distort the market. There have been a number of interesting decisions over the last few months. You'll see that a number of them are from the UK authority Ofgem, and in spite of Brexit, Ofgem still has the power to enforce REMIT. REMIT was imported into UK law when the UK left the EU, and in fact, the UK authority has been quite active in enforcing the rules. So the first I wanted to mention is a little bit outside the time scale that I had chosen, which is a year, but because it's a case involving one of the Baltic countries, in fact the first manipulation case involving a Baltic country, I thought it was worth mentioning. So this is a case by the Lithuanian energy regulator, and it's a market manipulation case involving a local energy company called UAB Geros Dujos, which engaged in something called marking the close. So it placed orders for a very small volume at an unusual price on the last day of each month, and then that was used as an index for fixing retail prices. This was the first decision by the Lithuanian energy regulator. It's a very short note, but it's worth a quick look, and you'll see that it worked closely with ACER in that case. The next case I wanted to talk about was a case involving a UK generator, so one of the UK gas-fired power stations, and it submitted notifications as generators are required to do, to say that it wouldn't be generating, and then the system operator needed the input of this particular power station, so it offered Intergen to run. And then Intergen submitted a revised notification to say that actually, in fact, it would be generating, which is what it was always intended to do. And so its statements increased the volume that the system operator needed to procure. And so Ofgem treated that as a market manipulation. This is one of the heaviest penalties that we've seen so far for an infringement of REMIT, so a penalty of 35 million, which was then reduced, and also a very significant payment back to the system operator, so around 15 million euros, which was then distributed back to the market participants via balancing charges. And the idea there was to compensate them for the amount that they had been overcharged through this manipulation. This case is a similar sort of case, but slightly concerning, because here the regulator found, and EDF admitted, that it had inadvertently sent misleading signals to National Grid. Ofgem concluded that this was an infringement through sending false or misleading signals. My concern with this is that REMIT is intended to catch manipulation of the market, and I think in order for there to be manipulation, there has to be some sort of intent to manipulate. So an inadvertent infringement, it may be a breach of rules relating to making accurate declarations and so on, but I don't think it can accurately be described as manipulation, and yet it was found to be that. The next case is a slightly unusual one, again involving a GB generator, but this is one of the very first inside information cases, so a failure to disclose inside information. And I think it's important because it illustrates some of the ACER guidance, which was amended fairly recently, on what is inside information. When you're in the energy sector, one of your questions is always, are my plans sufficiently certain and precise that it now counts as inside information and I have to disclose it? So what happened in this case was SSE, one of the big UK integrated companies, had announced a proposal to close Fiddler's Ferry, one of the large remaining coal-fired power stations, as you can see. It then entered into heads of terms to provide ancillary services, so things like black start services, to National Grid, and it decided to retain its grid access. And then on the 30th of March, it signed a binding contract. Ofgem concluded that the information that was already available on the 22nd of March was precise, and that if it had been announced to the market, it would have affected the prices of wholesale products. So this is a large power station, 1,455 megawatts, so about 3% of GB demand. Margins were tight, and so if this information had been known to the market, it might have influenced prices. And so Ofgem concluded that SSE should have disclosed this information as inside information when the heads of terms were signed, not waited until there was a binding contract in place. And as I mentioned, fairly recently, ACER updated the 5th edition of its guidance, and it provided quite a lot of information around this issue. So what happens where you have intermediate steps like this, non-binding heads of terms, negotiations and discussions, and what kind of information would a reasonable market participant take into account in making its pricing decisions. So this is a useful illustration of this very important issue. The most recent case is a case from the Spanish regulator, also very active in enforcing REMIT, a case involving a company called Rock Trading World. And as usual from the Spanish authority, if you're interested in REMIT, it's worth looking at these decisions. They're published in Spanish, but there is usually a summary in English, a short press release in English. I certainly find that Google Translate helps an enormous amount in looking at these decisions. But the decisions of the Spanish authority are very useful because they go into a lot of detail on its analysis of market manipulation. So it describes the offers in a lot of detail and then the analysis in a lot of detail. So what happened here was that Rock Trading World submitted a series of small offers, low volume, low price offers to sell gas. And this drove the price down, and then it was able to buy gas at a lower price. It had also submitted a couple of orders quite late in the trading day, just a second before the market closed. And the Spanish authority concluded that this involved layering and spoofing and marking the close, both quite well established forms of REMIT infringement. What's strange, I think, is that there's no mention in the Spanish decision of ACER's guidance. Again, if you're a fan of REMIT, you'll know that a couple of years ago, ACER produced some quite detailed guidance on layering and spoofing, and that's not mentioned here. The manipulation was a fairly short-term thing. It took place over 4 days. The CNMC imposed a fine of 60,000 euros. So in REMIT terms, quite a small penalty. The CNMC has previously imposed fines of up to 25 million, but this was a fairly small case. So in the last few minutes, I just want to touch on some quite recent guidance from ACER. If you're involved in electricity generation or trading or operating a transmission system, this will be of particular interest. As you'll know, ACER issues quarterly newsletters updating interested parties on REMIT issues. So there are always some useful statistics. There are always a few articles on issues of current interest. And in the latest edition, ACER published some guidance on how REMIT interacts with operational security. So particularly in areas of electricity balancing, ancillary services and redispatching, which are obviously becoming increasingly important as there is more and more renewable energy on the European grids. There's a greater need for various types of ancillary services and balancing and redispatching in order to keep the systems within N-1 and security limits. So there are a couple of issues that ACER pointed to. Firstly, and we saw a little bit of an indication of this in the two GB cases that I mentioned. So plants making inaccurate declarations of their ability to generate, and then that will form the basis for revised pricing. But also an issue which hasn't been addressed in any decisions yet, where a system operator will make a request to a balancing services provider for a balancing service, and ACER was reminding market participants that this information, that there is a requirement for a balancing service, is inside information, and it shouldn't be acted on until the information is in the public domain. And then in relation to redispatching, ACER focused on the question of inkjet gaming, which is a question that's been discussed around REMIT circles for a few years now. How is this treated under REMIT? And obviously ACER has now provided some guidance. So inkjet gaming is simply where there is a transmission constraint, a bottleneck, a generator will increase its output on one side of the bottleneck in the expectation of being redispatched downward at a higher price. You know that there's a constraint, and so that your output will be needed in order to balance the system on the short side of the constraint, and you know that the system operator will need to pay more for that redispatch than you would get just in the wholesale market. And there's a couple of pages of discussion of this in ACER's newsletter, which is very important and well worth reading. And ACER comments that that REMIT applies to inkjet gaming because this can have a detrimental effect on customers. It allows generators to anticipate congestion, possibly even making congestion worse by exaggerating the amount of generation on one side of a constraint. So it's an important note to read. ACER also talks about the manipulation of local markets. Again, increasingly we're seeing local markets becoming important with greater levels of distributed generation and demand, and greater levels of renewables. And so ACER is emphasizing that these are wholesale markets too and can be manipulated, and therefore that they're caught by REMIT. I just wanted then to move on to algorithmic trading. It's a slightly older piece of guidance now, but nonetheless important because algorithmic trading is becoming more and more important. So there are various concerns with algorithmic trading. It can malfunction, and it can be used to manipulate markets, and it can also be a target of manipulation. So if you know how a particular algorithm is going to work, then you can trigger it into behaving a particular way by submitting certain types of order that you know that the algorithm will pick up. And one of the key issues for algorithmic trading, one of the things that the regulators are getting increasingly focused on, is that in the energy sector we should import the best practices from financial services regulations. So it's important to understand the algorithms. They should include a kill functionality so that you can stop them if they're malfunctioning. Again, a local aspect to this, Nord Pool has produced some very useful and I think some of the best guidance on algorithms. So market participants, in short, need to understand the algorithm and how it works. Every staff member needs to understand the algorithm and what it does. You should ask your suppliers for a description. And as I said, it should also incorporate a kill function. We haven't yet seen a REMIT decision finding an abuse through an algorithm, but my prediction is that it won't be long before we do. That's not inside information, but just based on the importance of the issue. So I think having the right processes in place is absolutely fundamental to reduce that risk. Finally, coronavirus. We haven't seen anything specific from any of the regulators as far as I'm aware, but again, ACER's newsletter had some quite interesting and useful stuff. I think we can expect any attempts to exploit coronavirus, so differences in generation patterns, differences in consumption patterns, to be investigated. And it's important for market participants to understand how the algorithm works. So just key takeaways in the few remaining seconds. REMIT enforcement is relatively recent. There hadn't really been very much in the 6 or 7 years since REMIT came into force until late 2018. But now we see the regulators seeming quite comfortable in investigating very complex market situations and complex sets of facts. So I think we can expect to see that going forward. REMIT seems to catch a very wide range of conduct and market abuses. In gas trades in particular, layering and spoofing seem particularly common. In electricity, I think we're going to see more focus on redispatching and so on. There are quite a lot of cases under investigation. So at the end of 2020, ACER was looking at 282 cases. I think the other issue that we will see grow is private enforcement. So market manipulation can result in quite large consequences to the market, and I think we'll see market participants who've suffered as a result of an infringement, as a result of an abuse, starting to bring damages claims. That was a very short tour. You should have my contact details here. If anybody's got any questions, then please feel free to drop me a line. I'll stick around in some of the networking afterwards, so please feel free to ask me questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. Very insightful. Next, we will return with Marina Louhia. We will take a short break and set up the technically needed setups to be ready for you. So back in a second.